Hello, everyone. So I am Viscount Seamus O'Kelly, Order of the Laurel, and I'm from Ontier. Looks like we got a one Ontarian in here. But a This class is one of the introduction classes that we're doing through the Ontario Apothecary Guild. So it is, an intro level class, kind of just an overview of apothecary tools and kind of a way for people who are interested in maybe picking up apothecary as an area of study that can kind of build like a base. They can kind of build some knowledge at a real base level, and kind of give them a way to jump off from there and learn lots. So I'm going to share my screen. Oh, if
I'll fix
I
it.
thank you.
There you go.
Awesome. This one. All right. All right. So I really like pictures. There'll be lots of pictures. That's exciting. So this is apothecary equipment and shops, tools of the trade. This particular picture is from um, one of the herbals that we actually cover in the history of herbals class. It's from early 1300s, and I also really, not only do I like pictures, I really like apothecary jars. So a lot of them are going to have apothecary jars in it, just so you know. So this class is offered by the Ontario Apothecary Guild. It's in the Certificate of Apothecary Basics, and it is one of the required classes. Instructors are approved by the guild, um, and since I compiled it, I'm automatically approved. And I already did my introduction. So just real quick, right off the bat, apothecary shops. The word apothecary is derived from apotheca, meaning a place where wine, spices, and herbs were stored. During the 13th century, it became used to describe a person who kept these stocks. Up until the 13th century, apothecary was the place, and later it became also used to describe a person. Um, so they were sold from shops, they were sold from street stalls. Um, they not only sold medicinal stuff, they sold spices, they sold, um, other things as well, dyeing ingredients, that kind of stuff. So this picture is from the late 15th century. I really like it, not only because it has apothecary jars in it, but we can see our apothecary weighing using some tools, as well as in the background, you can actually see a sick person being treated by a physician who is doing uroscopy, which, side note, uroscopy is the examination of people's urine to determine whether they're sick or not, right? To determine how their balance of humors is off. And so that guy over there is checking that patient's urine to see if there are particulates, to see what color the urine is, if it's cloudy, um, the smell, the taste of it, all that kind of stuff. So it's a particularly fun apothecary shop picture. The first apothecaries were believed to have traded in the Middle East, and then from there, as the trades, went west, they ended up in Europe. Um, they're a fairly popular member of the medical field. However, they were not officially recognized in England until 1606 when they made the Society of Apothecaries. Um, a lot of my focus is on England because I am an English and Irish persona. So if you are not Western European, I apologize. I am working on expanding my knowledge outside of my focus. The recipes for wines, syrups, cordials, medicines were used by medieval apothecary. They were passed down through a generation, from generation to generation. They were closely guarded, and the idea is that, of course, if you have the best apothecary treatments, then you will have the most customers and, uh, you know, capitalism, right? Um, so, um, you would have apothecary would take apprentices, would teach those apprentices their craft, um, and there are some medical texts um, within our period that discuss treatments, obviously. However, I've not really found very many that are actually written by apothecaries. Most of them are written by physicians or scholars. Um, and this particular picture is from an apothecary in the 16th century, and it also has apothecary jars. All right. Oops. No, go back. No. Um, so even though they were not officially recognized until 1606, apothecaries used to be part of the Grocers Guild, um, and could be traced back to the Guild of Peppers, um, which were formed in London in 1180. Um, some of the most popular medicines were prepared in advance, ready for sale, and just like a modern day pharmacy today, your patient would come in, say they needed X treatment, and it would be made for you or be dispensed to you. And one of those is actually a great example of it is the Mithridatum or the Theriac, which is a multiple ingredient treatment for all of the poisons and all of the venoms. And it was also used to treat the plague or whatever. It was originally written and put together in the first, second, third century in Greece, um, and it was um, expanded upon as we move through our period. And by our later period, there are upwards of 70 some ingredients. And all of the ingredients were ground into a powder. They included multiple types of plants, roots. They included, if you were trying to treat uh, or prevent poison from venoms, then you would include flesh from the creature that you are trying to prevent yourself from. The idea is that that creature obviously is protected from its venom or it would die. So if we put some of its flesh in my treatment, then I will be protected as well. Um, and so it also included some beaver gland and some other animal type products. And then it was all ground into a powder, mixed with honey, and allowed to age. And quite often within the late period in Western Europe, it was actually illegal to sell a theriac if it hadn't aged at least um, a year. So that was definitely something that would have been made in advance. The longer you let it age, the more expensive it is, and the better your apothecary was viewed, their popularity with the people, the more their theriac would cost. Um, yeah, it's a super interesting treatment, and one of the examples of a treatment that was made in advance. However, other cures were prepared when they were needed. So if anyone has made a water or a decoction, or a wine, a medicinal wine, where you boil your plant material in the water, wine, vinegar, whatever, you will notice that within a few weeks, it starts to grow mold. So these type of treatments would have been made as the person came in. The person would have said, I have this issue, and we would make the water for them and send it with them. Treatments were made up with the apothecary using his knowledge of the patient, the illness, and the ingredients to prepare what he thought would be an ideal remedy. So the idea is that apothecaries had to know um, not only what the patient needed, they would need to know about the illness and then also be familiar with the ingredients. Um, and within our period, it was very common for the belief that patients' illnesses and the plants were all ruled over by the heavenly bodies. And so the idea is that a person who um, is suffering from the bloody flux, for example, um, the apothecary would have to know what part of that body is being affected by it. So we then know what heavenly body oversees that part of the body. We would need to know what the illness is and what heavenly body oversees that said illness, as well as the plants that we're putting into that treatment. They're overseen by a heavenly body, and we have to know how those all interact. So apothecaries had a pretty complicated trade.
We had a couple of questions.
Okay.
Um, are the remedies in the various late period household manuals similar to the apothecary remedies, or were they looked down on by the professionals?
So they're definitely very similar. And they're very similar ingredients and very similar uses. Um, and it's actually kind of interesting because the people who are writing these commonplace books are the ones who have access to apothecaries and medical staff. And so I'm not sure why they were making their own. I guess just it became popular to have your own medical stuff at home. I guess similar to us having over-the-counter medications. Um, but yes, the ingredients were very similar, very similar treatments. And as far as whether they were looked down upon by the apothecaries, I don't know. I haven't really seen anything that talks about it from how the apothecaries felt about these books coming out and these people doing this. However, I would think that they were partially okay in that these people would have to get their supplies from an apothecary, so they still would be making money off the people. However, they're not making money off the treatments because, as we know, capitalism, right? So I think that it was partially, at least they're going to be getting the supplies from me, but uh, they would probably look down upon it in that they were no longer getting the money from the people for the treatments.
Sorry, I accidentally muted you. I
It's
fixed
all
it.
right. No worries.
I had one other question. In terms of ingredients and or theories of healing, are there similarities to European apothecary remedies and Chinese herbalist remedies?
Um,
If you know
I
that,
I have no idea. So
which is
Chinese,
fair.
right? So Chinese medicine is probably the one I know the very least about. Um, I actually have a student who is her persona is from that area, and I actually, as a student gift, got her a series of books that were a Chinese herbal. Not at all for any reason other than that she needed it. I wasn't getting it for her, so I could look at it too. But so I don't know. I hope to explore that more.
Thank you.
All right. So uh, trained physicians were expensive, right? They were retained and hired by kings and nobles and the elite. They were um, few and far between. Uh, Not everyone had access to physicians. And so apothecaries kind of filled in the same similar area. Oops, gosh darn it. Stop clicking things, Seamus. Um, apothecaries filled the same hole or shared the hole in the medical field that barber surgeons did. And so the idea is that apothecaries served the more common people, similar to having a barber surgeon that would travel through areas and treat the people when they were in town. Apothecaries were there for the common folk, and to you allowed the people who were in the middle class and lower to, if they could afford it, get the knowledge of an apothecary and be treated. um, though there are examples of apothecaries who were taken on by kings. Henry VIII had his own royal apothecary, and in the letters from Henry's court, you can actually find itemized receipts of what Henry VIII had bought from his apothecary, which is super fun and exciting. But generally, apothecaries were more for the common folk, the middle class and lower. All right. So our first tool or tools is a mortar and pestle. So we got a neat little quote from a 1625 French physician, necessary to furnish an apothecary with a great mortar of, I can't see anything, with brass weighing 50 or 60 pounds or more, with a pestle of iron, a little mortar weighing 5 or 6 pounds with a pestle of the same matter, a middle-sized mortar of marble, and a pestle of wood, and a stone mortar with the same pestle. So the idea was that mortar and pestles do different things. They're used for different ingredients, and whether you are breaking something apart, like a crystal or rock or clay, um, or if you are grinding a plant material into a powder. And so the tools in apothecary had, as far as mortar and pestles, would be varied depending on what it is that they're doing, which I think is fantastic. It gives me all the reasons to buy all the mortar and pestles. Um, so I have quite the collection. So this is a 1600 Spanish mortar and pestle, um, and I really enjoyed that it had a device on it. And I have one very similar to this shape, so I think they're very fun. So mortar and pestles were a standard tool for apothecaries and physicians. They were used for centuries to grind reduced substances to powders, and you could use them to actually mix your ingredients if you were doing anything with medicine, alchemy, cosmetics, cooking, which all kind of are very similar in their processes, and there is materials that were the same material used in all four of them, right? They definitely overlap quite a bit. They're still used today in apothecaries and pharmacies. I work in a modern pharmacy, and though we're not a compounding pharmacy, I still have to be trained on how to use a mortar and pestle. And once a year, we have to make some sort of compound treatment using our mortar and pestle and grinding the material to show that we can make it in a small enough grain size that it will suspend in a liquid. Many mortars made during the 16th century had motifs including foliage, creatures, and faces. Mortar and pestles were also a standard domestic utensil. Um, thus it is likely that mortar and pestles were a bit simpler for those that than those who were a bit well off. Um, and the status of the user or shop would have played into what type of mortar and pestle was used. So we can kind of see that there are some very simple mortar and pestles throughout period, and there are some that are very decorative and very pretty, like this one. Um, oh gosh, I really am terrible at that. So this one is in the Victoria and Albert Museum. Um, and it is very similar to the mortar and pestle that I use. Um, and although mine's not as pretty. This one was made in 1540 in Holland. Um, it also includes Saint Sebastian being shot with an arrow, who was thought to be a protector from the plague. And so the idea is that this particular mortar and pestle would have been used for medicine, and less likely to have been used in a kitchen or something like that. Most families of middle wealth or above, particularly late period, um, would produce their own simple compound treatments, um, And so as it became more and more popular for people to have um, their own treatments, to read those commonplace books, to even get their own little mini stills. More murder and pestles would be seen within the houses used medicinally, opposed to just the ones that would have been used in the kitchen. And as we know, lots of things like sugar and stuff like that were supplied in larger container or larger loaves that needed to be broke apart. And so mortars and pestles were used to break those things down, as well as crushing your herbs. And your herbs didn't come in a little sprinkle bottle. Uh, you got the raw stuff, and you ground it yourself. All right, weights and scales. So this is actually from the Closet of Ladies and Gentlemen, late period English, kind of a commonplace book that was published. And I included this quote to show in this process of making a pomander that you needed to weigh drams, you needed to weigh scruples, you needed to weigh ounces and grains. And so early in period, most of our medical treatments will say a handful of this and two handfuls of that, or one portion of this to two of this. But later, as we get farther in our period, we start to see that they are much more particular and focused on the size amounts that they are putting in. And you would need a weight and scale to weigh these ingredients. So this particular image with apothecary jars shows an apothecary weighing something for his customer. It is from a castle in Italy. It's the 15th century. Um, it is particularly awesome. I really like being able to see that, someone is writing up receipts and someone is weighing something and there are things hanging. Um, it's just a really neat picture. So trading trading in these ingredients leads to the fact that we want to know how much we're getting, right? Uh, you want to be able to determine how much for your money you're getting out of these ingredients. And so we have records that go back as far as 5,000, 6,000 BC, showing that scales are used and people are measuring their product. Uh, Elizabeth Elizabethans, that is not what that says. Totally different. Egyptians and Babylonians are two of the earliest civilizations that use scales extensively. Um, and we have references within the Hebrew text of the Bible that mention scales. Um, and while the applications that the Egyptians and Babylonians were kind of crude as far as later period, if you compare those, that basic design traveled clear through our time period, and the scales they used were the forefathers of all of the scales that were developed. Um, Early on, these scales balances were often a simple wood beam with a hole at each end and one in the center. The beam was supported by a cord, which went through the hole, and then pans, which were supported by cords through the end holes, um, made up the balance. This design is called an equal arm balance because the weight of the material in one pan balances equal to the weight of the other. So if you want a ounce of said material, you will put an ounce what you think about as an ounce in the other and put your ounce of weight in the other and see if it balances. Taking a standard weight that how much this thing is and getting it to balance even with the material that you're weighing. Um, they're also called balance levers, and the center point acts as a fulcrum, and this while there were, um, improvements, they, over the next 2,000 years, they kind of improved those scales. Another type of scale, which is kind of interesting in far as the history of scales, little less for apothecary, but I think it's kind of important to see other scales and how they worked. So this is called a Roman steelyard. It was approximately 200 BC, and it was used for centuries. This particular one is from Pompeii, and the name of it is actually an English name that comes from a league in London in the 14th century. So they were used way before the 14th century, but what we call them was not until the 14th century. And so the idea with these is that you can weigh proportionally. So we know that for every 1 ounce of weight we put on our scale, that it will actually weigh out 20 ounces. And so we are able to, if we are going to weigh a large amount, we don't have to have a large amount of our weights on the other side. We know our proportion and we can calculate it that way. The movable hook weight, which you can see the hooks on the right side, is where your load would be attached, and then on the other side, you have your weight that would hang from it. And it's really unclear if this would be used in apothecary, but at some point in the trade route, it is possible that someone bought a large amount of product that would have ended up in apothecaries. So we've talked about the balances and the scales, but these are the weights that we are going to use to measure. These particular ones are also in the Victoria and Albert Museum. They apparently Nuremberg was particularly well known in late period for making very nice weights. As you can tell, it is a very nice set. And they're nesting weights. So they're kind of like Russian nesting dolls in that there's a smaller one on the inside and you can unpack them. This allows you to have all of your weights in one spot, nice, easy way to transport them. I have a nesting weight set. They're really fun. And we know that this was made for a very well-to-do person, because it is, not strictly for use. You can tell it's also decorative, and what was particular about Nuremberg is that the Council of Nuremberg really regulated the weights of the scales. And so we have this idea that we know if we are getting weights from Nuremberg, that when I weigh my scruple, I am actually going to have a scruple. And apparently they were tested. People, could really, feel like they had great credibility in using these scales. So some common measurements. This just kind of touching on this is specifically because common measurements were anything but common. They change throughout time. They're completely dependent on what region you're from. And so if you're going to be studying apothecary, if you want to get down into the nitty gritty, research these particular measurements that were used. So for me, this is later period England. The apothecary weights that were used were all based on a grain as your smallest amount, kind of like a millimeter, or we'll say a milligram, and then you go up to a gram, and then you go up to a kilogram. So the idea is that a grain, uh, 20 of those grains will make up a scruple, and then your next level up is a dram, which is made up of 3 scruples. An ounce is made up of 8 drams, and a pound is made up of 12 ounces. So as we can see, we're not looking at 16 ounces in a pound like we use modernly. And we can also see that there is no standard frequency in which we're going up. We're going up by 20, we're going up by 3, we're going up by 8, and then we're going up by 12. And so, there's nothing standard or common about the measurements within period, but it is definitely a tool that an apothecary would use. And so I recommend finding out, based on your time and region, what the measurements would have been, because you will get completely different ratios of products when recreating a treatment. My favorite part of the whole class, jars and containers. So the earliest known jar containers are from the trading of drugs and spices between Babylon and Egypt, from 2250 BC. Um, they are this particular bottle you can see over here is from the 500 to 300 BC. Um, it's super neat. They were often unglazed earthenware or carved out of alabaster. Um, and then approximately 750 years later, Egypt had started to make ones out of glass for your very expensive substances. So, we can see that throughout period there are treatments that are made with ingredients that are a little bit harder to find versus your common plants that can be practically picked out in the wild. And so the Egyptians were using those very expensive ingredients, the ones that were harder to find, trying to like saffron, for example, right? We know an ounce of saffron is worth significantly more than an ounce of rosemary. And so these very expensive substances would have been kept in glass containers to, they're fancier, they're nicer. You want your nicer ingredients in nicer containers. Greeks and Romans used alabaster earthenware, glass, not flask, horn, lead, onyx, and silver. And then Dioscorides writes in De Materia Medica that some medicines should be kept in glass, horn, or silver, while botanicals should be stored in lime wood boxes. And so throughout period, we see that different containers are made out of different materials, some based on how expensive they were, others based on what was kept in them. Obviously, if your unglazed earthenware container, if you have one of those, you're not going to necessarily put something in that is going to leach into the material. You're going to want to use something that is not going to have that transfer of what they called the essence of your ingredients.
Quick question about weights. Um,
Yes.
did the weight progression have some numerological symbolic meaning?
I don't know. Um, Not that I'm aware of. That's definitely something to look into. It would also be interesting to um, kind of look into the differences between the different sets, and how they've changed, not only through time but uh, in relation to each other in location. But sadly, I don't know if it was. Any other questions?
The other question that I have was about ingredients.
Mhm.
Would do you think it would depend on the availability of the ingredients for what would commonly be used in the treatments in a specific area?
Yes. So there are there are herbals, which discuss where you can find plants, right? And so if you have the ability to um, go out into your garden and pick an ingredient versus uh, head down to the apothecary and buy an ingredient that had to be shipped in, and thus the price of it has increased through the trading of hands, through hands. You would choose, unless the other ingredient is significantly far superior, you would of course want the cheaper one. And I think that is something that uh, apothecaries would have to kind of balance, right? Um, and doctors do that modernly, right? Your medicines have side effects, and so your what you're trying to get out of it is that balance of what are the side effects going to be, as well as what this ingredient or what this medicine is going to cost. If I can take a blood pressure med that is $4 a month versus I can take one that's 400, and the $4 one is going to do just fine, that I will want that one. Um, and so I think you know the apothecary would be making that decision based on you know the patient and how much that patient can afford, or if I think this is going to be just as good for the patient, I can use a cheaper ingredient, because it is better to get you know a little bit of money out of this person than them leave because they can't afford the other. So I think the cost of the different ingredients really would be a balance and decision thing at the time you're making the ingredients.
So then that would mean that the treatments in Europe might not be the same as in China because of the cost and availability of the ingredients would be limiting.
Exactly. um, and there are ingredients that are used a little bit, that you got from China, where it is probably more likely that in China it would have been used all the time because it's great and superior, but they have more access to it.
That's all we've got right now.
All right. Um, so the earliest apothecary jars that we kind of think of when we think about apothecary jars existed in about 10th century in Persia. Um, and then they made their way into Italy in the 14th century, and then west of the 1500s. And that's this jar kind of shaped like this, painted, um, and decorative, and gorgeous. And they um, they have some actually, like in museums you can actually go and see them up close. It's super neat. So this particular jar that is pictured does not have a scroll on it, or any notation of what would be in the jar. And so the idea is that this jar is probably used, um, kind of like your Tupperware container that you put whatever your leftovers are in it. So this is whatever you get in stock, you throw it in there, versus you have that container that you really save for something. This is your whatever your if it's free when you get your shipment, or when you go and buy something from the farmers. Um, there are references within our herbals who actually talk about how dangerous and how much the apothecary and the herb trade needs to be regulated, because we have these people who are illiterate and don't know anything about medicine picking plants and selling them to people who then sell them to apothecaries. Um, So, but anyway, so if we just were buying this ingredient from a plants, um, uh, buying these plants from farmers, um, we would, um, as we get what we get, we would put it in one of these jars. Um, So, and then there are also some examples of these jars having a blank label on them. So a scroll being painted across it so that you could, um, write in a grease pencil or whatever what's in it. But it could be wiped off and removed. As well as there are examples of tags, or if you have a lid on it. It was common to use like a waxed linen and tie it. You could tie your tag from that string that you use to tighten down your wax linen, or you could make some sort of notation on your wax linen of what's in your container. Other jars, um, which were made for very common things that you just always had in stock, or things that were particularly special. So there are theriac jars who, have on them, it says theriac. It would have been used for theriac because it is so important and special. And any apothecary worth his salt would have some theriac, right? And so that was the other option, was to have the jars that were specific to a particular ingredient or treatment that were noted on them versus the ones like this one pictured that does not. There's a couple other examples um, of some period ones. Um, I think the one from Spain on the right there is particularly interesting in that it has a crest of the Luna family, um, and um, also shows their rabbits uh, nibbling on a grapevine. Um, and so there are images of apothecaries with lots of jars in the background that have various different devices on them, um, as well as this one on the left, which has a phrase on it, which is kind of interesting, and I have not seen very often. And it says, "Modesty comes from faith, and faith comes from paradise." Um, which I think is very interesting and not a common example of what we think about when we think about apothecary jars. Uh, we think of more like the one on the previous page.
So a couple of questions here.
Yeah.
Um, were the designs on the jars typically made to match the contents or branding by the apothecary?
Yeah. So there are examples of if if they didn't have what was on them, uh, they would have the ingredients, or they would have the floral designs of the plants, and scholars believe that the ingredients within that jar would have matched what is on the outside.
The other one was how. Oh, actually, would these also have lids?
So there are examples of some that have a lid that sit down on them. Then the other way would be with a waxed linen, um, period saran wrap, where the wax has been soaked in hot wax. The linen has been soaked in a hot wax, and then if you get it warm with your hand, it's moldable. You can put it down, makes a fairly nice seal, and then you can uh, take a string and wrap around it and kind of tighten it down. But there are examples of lidded apothecary jars that just have your ceramic or clay lid that just fits down inside, like we think of a jar with a lid.
The other question that I have here was how common was fraud with the apothecaries? Like um, white bryony substituted for mandrake, but sold as mandrake.
Totally, yeah. So that was totally a thing. Um, and we think of a real good example is actually treatments or jars of unicorn horn. Um, the sadly, we know that unicorns don't exist, right? And so we know that that container that said it had a unicorn horn in it did not actually have it. And so there are definitely examples of ingredients like that. Um, and honestly, uh, there are plenty examples of a green leafy herb ground into small bits. And if it doesn't have a particularly distinct smell, you don't know what it is. You can't tell it from anything. Um, as well as there are examples of, um, especially in late period and in Western Europe, of regulations and um, cities making laws against apothecaries who um, might be trying to make less than effective treatments. So there definitely are examples of laws coming into effect that were used to help counteract the fraud that being done by apothecaries.
Were corks ever used for closing jars?
Um, I I have not found any examples of it. Um, it seems completely plausible. It might just be because corks, um, degrade quicker. Um, I use them in my displays, and I think it's completely plausible. I don't have any examples of it, but I believe they
Alrighty.
were. All right. All right. Surgeon chests and medicinal chests. So this particular one is a late period Italian. Um, and is by far one of the most gorgeous things I've ever seen. Um, it is this particular one was made for the last Genoese governor of Chios, um, and what happened is the Turks invaded in the late 16th century, and the Genoese were exiled from the area and taken over by the Turks. So this was made for the last governor of the island. So we know the time frame based on, it was made for this particular person. Um, the image on the lid is post period, but you can see on the left side that the that drawer that's sitting in the front would have gone in that left side in the center there, and so it opens from the top, has little containers and boxes. The drawer, the center level has a drawer that comes from one side, and then you can see that the bottom drawer comes from the right. So it contains approximately or about 127 bottles and pots for drugs. It also contains scales, a pair of Bryce weights from a nest set, so it looks like it's missing some of them. It had a marble mortar, can't talk all of a sudden, and an agate pestle. Had some brushes, probably used to brush out your mortar after you ground something into it to get all of the goody bits. Some pewter boxes and some organic material. 95 of the drug containers still had paper labels on them and were readable or partially readable. Um, and then we can go through and see which of the ingredients or the items were from particular uh, sources about the time. De Materia Medica, though written in the first century, was used clear until the 1800s, and so we can. It's really kind of considered the father of herbals, and we can see that 27 of the 27 of the treatments in the box were from that, as well as 34 um, from the other two, which 34 from Mattinelli, and then the 21. Those are both Italian specific uh, herbals and medical texts. Uh, and then there are three ingredients that were not on any of those lists: crocus, and unicorn's horn. So we know that whatever is in that jar or pewter container is not unicorn's horn. Um, Likely a horn of another creature, or there are examples of um, the horn from um, the whale with a giant tusk. Why? Narwhal, narwhal, narwhal. So, uh, there are a couple ideas that we think this unicorn horn might be from, um, but we know it is sadly not unicorn horn. And there are actually there's a if you look up, let's go back, the name of the chest, which I slaughter every time because I'm not Italian. But if you look up that chest, there actually is a paper that actually breaks down all of the things that are in it, uh, what the label says, and where it's from. It's pretty neat. Next box that we're going to look at is the Mary Rose Surgeon box. Um, so when they brought up the Mary Rose, which is just amazing, um, they found within the surgeon's cabin this box. And so we know that he would have, since he was the surgeon on the ship, he would have been their doctor, he would have been their dentist, he would have been their pharmacist, he would have done everything. And we also can see that there are razors and whetstones, and so he acted as like a barber surgeon. Um, Within this wooden chest, they found canisters that were filled with ointments, and then in some of the jars and stuff, um, it was in the water. Most of the organic material, like the dried herbs and stuff, obviously are not going to survive at the bottom of the bay. But one of them did contain peppercorns, and so we know that they contained botanical ingredients. He also had two metal syringes, um, and they're not syringes in the way we think of them, but more used for couple options: sticking into a wound and flushing it, which is super fun, or there are treatments that involve sticking the metal syringe up the urethra to treat syphilis, things like that. Also contains some surgical tools and a bowl to collect patient's blood. Um, and the Mary Rose Museum has it all on display. I have had a couple friends who, when they have visited it, have sent me pictures, which brings me so much joy. There is a book on the Mary Rose that does reference and give an itemized um, list of the ingredients. I ordered one like a year ago and it never showed up. It's super hard to find. But you can find an atomized list of all of the ingredients and all of the items that would be in this chest. Any questions on those before we move
Nope, I don't see anything.
on? All right. Just a quick mention of sieves. There are references to your ingredients being sieved, basically ran through a mesh so that the fine stuff falls through. This particular image is of their wheat, and it's not super apothecary-esque, but there seems to be, I could not find any medical images of people using a sieve, but we know from texts that sieves were used. Um, so that is a tool that apothecaries would have. Not super interesting. Most of us know what a sieve is, so. Distillation tools. Um, so by late period, it became very popular that if you had a manor house, you had your own mini still. We also know Henry VIII was an amateur apothecary. There is a medical text written by him and four physicians from the court where they made ingredients or made treatments out of ingredients. Some of them were stilled, some of them were not, and it is believed that he was involved in about 100 of them. Um, so late period, it became very popular for you to have your own still and to make your own sweet waters or to make your own stilled ingredients. And so this particular quote uh, involves stilling roses, and this is uh, this is not an ingredient list or recipe for um, medicinal uses, other than the idea that scents can also help your balance your humors. This is more for a cosmetic and making a perfume. Um, but I included it because it's an example of us actually seeing that in period they did do some distilling. Distillation is the chemical process in which certain constituent components were extracted from liquids through heating and condensation. Um, and so the idea is, you have your ingredient in some liquid, it evaporates out, condenses, and is collected. So the most common tool is an alembic, um, and there are a couple people within the SCA who can recreate these for you out of clay. Rita Tang has got one from them, and then there's someone else who does one. Um, and they're basically two pieces of ceramics where one sits on top of the other. You put all of your stuff and water in the bottom one, and it goes up into the top one and dribbles out. It's pretty neat. Um, and this image is from a German distillation handbook that was written in the 15th century. There are references earlier of distillation. However, this was the first medical text that was written specifically just about distilling. Um, and is also where this image uh, on this page is the title page of that handbook. Uh, it's the Das Buch de Distillerien, so it's the book of distilling. And the kind of the most common shape for an alembic is on the left side of this, the third one down, the two spherical shapes that connect together. They're made of pottery, they're made of glass, um, and they likely were used clear back in the 1100s in Italy, and they can be used to distill not only your oils from plants, but also to make mineral acids like sulfuric acid or stuff like that. They're also used in households to make spirits or medicine. Um, and there are examples of, it's also used by alchemists, and there are, images of period apothecaries where you can see some distilling in the background. Um, Speaking of images, so these are some really neat images. The one on the left is from the that same book, which shows a pretty cool big producing distillation tool, and you can see that it is very likely that um, in the front you would have built your fire underneath it, and then those cones on the inside of those would have your containers where you had your material and water, and then they would condense up inside that cone and then run out the spout into your collection tube. And as we can see, the little thing has chimneys where the smoke from your fire would be going out on the sides. And then the one on the right shows a couple different distillation setups. with a spherical stove instead of the square one, but a couple different shapes and people in process of making uh, their distilled products. So as we saw from the one of those first images of apothecary shops, we saw that guy doing uroscopy. And so a quick mention of uroscopy, um, because urine is fun. So the on the right there, we have an extant 15th century uroscopy vial. Um, and on the right, or the left, we have a uroscopy wheel. And a uroscopy wheel shows various different colors that urine can be, um, and is kind of a reference guide for medical staff. And so uroscopy is a medical examination of urine to facilitate a diagnosis of a disease or disorder. So modernly, we know that there's bacteria that can then be that can come in urine, right? Uh, and that bacteria affects the color of your urine, or the taste of your urine, or the smell of your urine. As you can see, there is a green example on there and one that is kind of bluish gray. There are bacteria that will turn your urine green, uh, not just Baja Blast from Taco Bell. Um, your most of the wheels contain 20 different colors. They range from white as well water, to ruddy as pure gold, or to black as a very dark horn, which is very bad. Um, no reference of having black urine in any of the medical texts say you're going to do anything but die. Um, and then the flasks are most commonly used to examine the urine. Most of them were round bottom, and the clearer and free of glass bubbles, the higher the quality of the flask. Um, and so there are many examples of medical staff, doctors, physicians, looking through, pulling back the drapes on a room and holding it up to the light. It's a very common image of uroscopy flasks. Knives and fleams. Um, so we cut things, right, in apothecary. So, and medical staff cut people. So this is kind of just a little quick overview of some things used to cut and what they would cut. And so we can see on the left, we have someone harvesting wheat. And there are examples of the cyclical knives being requested in the medical text to use for harvesting particular plants. And on the left, or on the right, don't know my left from my right apparently, we have a flame being used to bleed a person. So knives for harvest or preparation. Um, so as we kind of go along, our treatments become kind of less superstitious, um, and more science based, even though there's a lot that they didn't understand. Um, but early in period, we have examples of the type of blades being very specific on what you're going to harvest your plants with. There are examples of different materials, like, you must use a stone knife, or you must use a knife out of a particular metal type or shape, like the cyclical one, or they must be wet or dry. There are references of it being, you know, dipped in water before you cut and harvest your plant. There's some where you have to stick it in the ground in a new moon for overnight before you pull the knife out and harvest your plant. There are examples of various oils or greases being used on the plant. I was just reading one that involved using sheep suet on the knife before you harvest a plant. And so there are examples of different types of knives being used in different types of materials. And then there are some treatments require the knife be used by a particular person. So the plant must be harvested by a woman, or the plant must be harvested by a man. Um, Sometimes it is a young man or a young woman. Quite often, if they reference hair color, it is a redhead that must be doing said harvesting. On top of, they must have a cyclical knife and do it in a new moon, and it must be a virgin redhead. So that, there are examples of middle and early period where the knives need to be particular, um, as well as, like I said, in the new moon. So particular types of the places of the year or by phases of the moon. Um, the image here is a little out of our period. It's from 1603. Uh, this is the image I used for my laureline outfit. This botanist has in his hand a really neat tool, which I just had to include. It is an axe-like thing, so with a pick on one side, so you can use the axe to hack or cut, the pick to dig in the earth, and then on the bottom of it is a little spade, which you can use to dig. It's a super neat knife thing, and I just thought it was really unique and fun. So fleams and bloodletting bowls. Um, so the idea is that we are made up of uh, four different fluids, or they believe that we are: blood, uh, biles, and um, phlegm. And so if those are out of balance, we get sick. And so if you have too much blood, then the obvious answer is to bleed that person and bring them back in balance. And so one of the common tools is a phlegm. And so there are a couple different ways of bleeding someone. So this one, phlegms were used to open a vein and bleed them. There are other examples of tools that have a bunch of little short blades on them, and they kind of scrape and cut the top level of your skin so that you're not actually going deep enough to hit veins. But Flames were used specifically to open up your veins and bleed you. There are examples of sharp thorns being used or sharpened stones. Um, and these are the earlier examples. And then the first kind of mention of a phlegm itself is in an Anglo-Saxon manuscript from around 1000 AD. And then later we get to see that the French have a 16th century phlegm, um, which has an opening, has your cutting device on one end to open it, and then a blunt one which you can keep the slit open to allow more blood to drain. And so on our right we have the four pictures. The top one is actually a Roman early period phlegm. The middle one is more of what we think of when we think of the medieval phlegm, and then the bottom one is a drawing of that French phlegm. So on the one side you can see the pointed bit, and on the other side is your flat spot to open, keep the wound open. And these would have dripped quite often into a bloodletting bowl. And on our left we can see um, a bloodletting bowl with a hole or a divot in the side. This would allow you to stick your patient's arm up through that and rest in there so that the blood was able to drain into the bowl and not spill all over. There are also examples of bloodletting bowls that have just a little handle on them that you can hold with one hand under the patient's arm while you bleed them.
Do you know what the name of the axe spade tool is?
I don't. And honestly, I've never seen like any other references to it. It's just in that one painting. Um, And someone actually, I have two of them. Someone made me a couple, uh, and I was just super excited. But I have not found any other references to it or any other images of it or its name. Uh, it's just referred to often as uh, the botanist's tool.
Somebody said that mattock is the tool without the shovel.
Um,
Um,
oh, the name. So if it was just the pick and the little axe for harvesting, it
yeah,
would be
yeah.
okay. Cool. Neat. Um, so herbals. So this is a very important tool of um, our apothecaries and medical staff in general. Um, there is a whole class on the history of herbals that kind of goes more in depth. So this is just kind of a quick blurb about it. So an herbal is any book that contains the names and description of plants, and then often will include uh, medical stuff about it, whether it's toxic, how they smell, if they have any magical properties. A lot of them will include the legends that are associated with them or where you can find them. Um, it can be found in the meadows or it can be found in the forest. And then quite often they'll have illustrations, usually to help your person identify said plant. But definitely earlier in period, we can see that a lot of the images don't help. In fact, there is a medical text that modern scholars just are constantly bickering and just arguing about what the plants are. Um, so these are a couple examples of our classical and antiquity herbals. So De Materia Medica, like we've mentioned before, approximately 770 AD, describes nearly 600 plants and has about 1,000 simple drugs. He's the one who is the grandfather of almost all of our Western European herbals, and he was used and referenced clear into the 1800s. Um, his herbals are just amazing. Sadly, the original is not uh, around as far as we can tell. There is fourth century, fifth century. Can't remember if it's fourth century or 400s. Um, that is in Vienna, made for a ruler of the time, and that is our earliest known example of it. It's made up of five different books, um, and super fun. Um, then a natural history by Pliny, written just we don't know exactly for sure when it was written. However, we know he was born about 23 CE and he died in the eruption of Vesuvius. So we know it was written within that period. Um, what's super neat about this is it contains 37 books. Not all of them are about plants or about medicinal stuff, um, but within his herbal sections, he references 2,000 other manuscripts um, and a bunch of different authors. So like it was really like he compiled a bunch of information from the time and put it into these 37 books. Um, if you're interested in getting either of these, De Materia Medica is super expensive. It's not in print, but there is a free online PDF version. Um, and so if you um, do the Googles uh, for De Materia Medica free PDF, there's one that comes up. It's Cancer Links, like the cat, .com, and you can download it all 5 books. It's pretty fantastic. Pliny the Elder, there is a complete version available on Amazon Kindle. So as well as there are his books split into 3 or 4 different books into one. You get the whole series in hardback. So some of our middle age herbals, kind of in the middle of our period. Physica by Hildegard. originally written around 1150. It's the earliest book on natural history written in Germany. Um, she, Hildegard, if you don't know anything about her, besides the fact that she talked to the devil and wrote music, um, super fantastic, interesting person. She is kind of considered the mother of botany. So we have there's the four fathers of botany. She's considered the mother, and her recipes really uh, include treatments that were handed down through generations by her predecessors. So she was an abbess, and she had an abbey that she oversaw, and the church in those areas, if they didn't have a doctor, you came to the church, right? And so she compiled a bunch of recipes, medicinal recipes that had been passed down through the church into her book called Physica. Um, Also available, you can get a hard copy of it on Amazon. It's fairly easy and it's not super expensive. The Tactanum Santatis um, is a really interesting book, in that there were four complete manuscripts found in four different places across Europe. No author listed. They believe they were written by the same person. They don't all contain the same uh, images. They don't all contain the same plants. Uh, but uh, uh, like this image with a mandrake could be in two or three of them. And then a different one will be in the other one. And then one of them will have this plant, but not in the others. And so it's kind of a mix. There is a hardback example of this herbal that actually has a graph or a spreadsheet in the back that lists where each one is in. It's kind of super interesting. And the idea of it is that those four humors that we talked about earlier are kept in balance by six different things. Um, and so there you have your medicines, but your food is can keep you in balance or knock you out of balance. Your social status, uh, your clothes that you wear, your activities that you do, the winds that you're in, all of these things can affect that balance. And so this book, which is often called the health handbook, the medieval health handbook, uh, is an example of what a medieval person could have done in their everyday life to try and rebalance their humors. And then we have a couple examples of some post-printing press herbals. So with the invention of the printing press in the 1400s, we saw a big boom of these medical texts and them becoming uh, not just written in Latin, but written in their home language, uh, being uh, available to more people. And these two are both examples of late period English, um, and both super popular for their time. The Herbal by John Gerard, uh, super fun. Um, has the first woodblock print of potato in it, the what they call the Virginian potato. Um, and he also goes into discussing who eats these things, whether he's tried to grow them. Super neat. Has 1,800 woodcuts. Um, Most of it has been taken from other herbals, and he just reprinted it, but it's still super neat. Um, it was published right at the end of our period. The William Turner's herbal um, is the other one. Uh, it was the first herbal written in English. Um, it's made up of there's three different editions of it, and one actually lists a really neat um, comparative on the names of plants. And so this is what it's called in English. This is what they call it in France. This is what they call it in Germany, and this is what they call it in somewhere else. I can't remember where the other place is. And so that idea that when we're talking about a plant, uh, we know that it's not always going to be the same name. And so he starts to kind of take that on by listing them and what they're called in their various regions, because we don't have botanical names at this point, right? We don't have, or the idea of that is just kind of barely starting. Botany is barely started, and so he kind of starts to tackle that idea that we're going to have different names for plants. Our next text are almanacs, and almanacs are we often think of almanacs for farmers, right? But there actually were medicinal almanacs. And by the late 1500s in part of Europe, it was actually illegal for a physician to treat a patient without proper referencing to the position of the stars and the moons. So, like I talked about earlier, parts of the body, plants, illnesses, all affected by heavenly bodies, or at least it was believed that they were. And so the idea is to properly treat a patient, you have to do a star chart. You have to know where the moon, where all of the planets are at this particular time, and that will affect your treatment. And so many physicians would carry a text with them that had all of these references in them. It was kind of your physician desk reference, right? And so there are cool examples of like belt books where they have the knot on one end and you can loop it through your belt. Um, and there are neat examples of like the image that we have here. It actually folds into three pieces. It's like a trifold. And so the book is long and narrow, and then when you open it up, it folds out. Um, and this particular image is of the Zodiac Man. And so we can see different representations, like the Leo rules over the chest. And so you can see the lion laying across his chest. Um, Aries is your head. You can see there's a goat on his head. Um, and and so this will help be a reference for your medical staff so they can be reminded of which areas uh, of your body are affected by which heavenly body or by which constellation. So the genre of almanacs dates at least as far back as the period of Ramses in 1304 to 1168 BC. Um, they are books, they're pamphlets, they're single sheets, or they're folded mini books. So there are multiple different types of almanacs that all kind of fall within that genre. Um, so as we've talked about, almanacs are not always written for medicinal readers. Um, Weavers, constables, merchants, grocers, farmers, all these people could have an almanac that was specific for their field. And then with the invention of the printing press, almanacs moved to from more commonly handwritten to printed. And these are some examples of what would be in medicinal almanac. So we have the bloodletting man, which is basically an image of quite often the person is spread with their legs and arms out, kind of like the Merovingian man. But there are drawn veins on his body, so you can see where the veins are and which ones you would then need to bloodlet. Um, there would be an astrophysical discourse. It kind of reminds uh, and talks about the differences and how these affect, um, and then as well as how astrology will be part of determining the treatment, as well as the person's age, gender, and such. Then we would have a diagram that shows the effects of the zodiac house on each part of the body. They quite often would have a uroscopy chart like the wheel we saw earlier. Um, there would be eclipse and moon diagrams specific for the time that the almanac was made. The sphere of Apuleius. So super neat idea, and something I have barely just scratched the surface of. But the idea is numerology, and the name and the day they became ill. Uh, you use this chart, and it actually will determine the likelihood of the patient surviving, um, which I just thought was super fun. Dates of major feasts and holidays, tide tables, uh, historical chronological references. And so, like, if you were in England, um, yours would have a list of the kings and the years that they ruled, as well as just a calendar showing months, dates, and year, within a year or so of said almanac's printing.
And we did have one question.
Yeah,
Weren't there also cheat sheets? This was like a one-page format that was full of like a map,
a map of.
like a well, it was folded like a map, so it was like kind of
Oh
folded
yeah,
in.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So totally almanacs. One of the examples of almanacs. There are one sheeted. They came as as fancy as multiple pages folded into this book, to pamphlets that are printed and just a couple pages, to single sheets that you would carry in your pouch. And that's it. So apothecary really covers our entire period, every practical part of the globe. The tools are super varied, and so really, this is kind of a general idea of some of the tools that were used. Um, so my hope is that you will then go find what the tools look like in your particular area, and kind of use it as a springboard to find out more about how apothecary was in your time and place.